Later, in a boardroom that smells of lemon cleaner and expensive cologne, I would stand, dusty hard hat in my hands, and watch them all realize the janitor who had been stepped on for months was the man whose signature sat on the company charter. But that was months away, and the boardroom was a polished future I could taste but not touch. So on my first day, I was holding a broom and pretending not to notice the door with my family name on the plaque, a few inches higher than my temporary badge allowed me to see. I remember the grit in my throat more than anything else, the factory dust that smelled like old oil and better days, and the way my stomach tightened when the foreman barked my new name at me like it was a joke he'd already made a dozen times that morning. They called me new guy for the first 8 hours and trash for the next two, and I let them because I had to. I had signed the temp forms, taken off my cufflinks, traded my suit for a stolen safety vest, and learned to swallow pride like it was another piece of metal on the assembly line. My father built this place with his hands and his promises. When he died, he left me the company in his will, and then a trustee and a board full of smiling vultures set about turning his legacy into quarterly numbers. That is what I told myself as I wiped grease off a conveyor belt at dawn, because if I let my anger loose here, it would be the easiest thing for them to crush. The men in charge, especially one named Marcus, made sure I knew my place before I even found out where the break room was. He wore an old high-visibility jacket like armor and had the kind of smile that never reached his eyes, the sort that sizes you up and decides if you're worth a conversation. On my first walkthrough, he pointed at the spill of coolant by the press and said, "You picked it up yet, new guy? We'd hate to lose the entire run because you're slow." He did not know I had once sat with my father at that very press, learning the rhythm of it by touch. He did not know anything about me, and that was the whole point. Menial work teaches you things about a place you can't read in quarterly reports. It teaches you where the shortcuts are hidden, where the money leaks like a busted pipe, and who thinks rules are suggestions. I learned how to unlatch a jam in 40 seconds flat without the supervisor noticing, how to tell by the wear on a gear whether it had been replaced with a counterfeit part, and how to carry 3 boxes that were technically 50 pounds each without crying. Everyone laughed when I tripped on the third step carrying inventory. They applauded when the real veteran did the same thing, because veterans earn their bruises and new guys earn ridicule. Marcus made sure the ridicule came for everything I did. He handed me worse equipment than the others, gave me the dirtiest station, and tracked my hours like he was counting the beats of a heart he wanted to stop. "Everyone's got to earn their keep," he'd say, his voice syrupy in front of the crew and cold alone, like the weather that only seems to matter on payday. When I asked him a question about protocol, simple stuff, he smirked and said, "If you knew your place, you'd know better than to ask questions you can't answer." He treated me like a stain he was trying to scrub out of the floor, and that underestimation is the thing I would use against him later. It hurt in ways that didn't show on the surface. I felt each slight in my chest, the sneers, the nicknames, the way shift supervisors rerouted work to make my day longer, like a small wound that kept getting picked at. But I also watched. I listened. There are ears to pick up in a shop like this if you put your head down long enough and keep your mouth shut. I took notes on the back of delivery forms, memorized faces that came and went through the loading dock at odd hours, and tucked a cheap recorder into the brim of my hat. It felt like cowardice at times, pretending to be beaten, but that pretense was armor more effective than Marcus could ever imagine. There was a woman on the second shift who folded shirts in silence like she was folding a secret into the fabric. Her name was Rosa, and she moved through the floor with a tired sort of dignity that made Marcus treat her with the same contempt he reserved for anyone who didn't kiss his ring. I watched her more than I interacted, because you learn to pick allies carefully. On the first day, I saw her slip a photo into her locker, and I wondered who she had lost to the same cold decisions that kept wages low and safety corners cut. Later, she would be the person who handed me the missing piece of the puzzle, the one whose quiet courage saved both of us. On that morning, she simply nodded at me like a lighthouse might nod at a ship, and I clung to that nod like it was a promise. By the time the sun had climbed and the first order of the day left the dock, I smelled less like the boardroom and more like the guts of the place, which was exactly where I needed to be. Blood and oil were very similar in texture, it turned out, and both have a way of leaving a trace. Marcus ran the floor like a king with a broken crown, and he made sure everyone knew he could crush any of us with the flick of a hand. He also left a trail of bad decisions, and on that first day I started mapping them in my head. I could feel the future in small things, a ledger hidden behind a safety sheet, a vendor whose invoices never matched deliveries, a safety drill everyone skipped. None of it seemed like much to the men who laughed at me, but to me, it was the beginning of a trail that would not end until someone paid. The first thing they teach you on the line is how to make yourself small and invisible, and I got very good at it fast because invisibility was my only weapon. I let the insults bounce off me like rain off a hood and kept my gaze on the work, because looking back meant answering questions I could not afford to ask. Marcus loved to humiliate in front of the crew, and he saved his best lines for me, as if public degradation was a way of testing the rest of them too. "New guy, why don't you go sweep the acid out of Bay 3? You look like you want to get a real job." He said it like a joke. He turned it into an assignment. He sent me into a corner where the ventilation was barely working and the warning placard had been torn in half, and I inhaled fumes that made my head buzz for hours afterward. I coughed until my voice gave out, and he watched my hands shake while the guys who could have helped pretended they didn't see me. Because looking like an ally of the new guy meant you were next in line to be broken. They assigned me tasks nobody wanted on purpose. Fix a forklift with fried wiring and no gloves while the veteran mechanic stood around and whistled. Haul pallets that were marked at 90 pounds but were phantom heavy because fake filler had been dumped inside to hide skimped loads. Clean up spills that managers had decided were cheaper to ignore than to report, because a reported incident would trigger inspections and costly repairs. I learned quickly that the company had two sets of rules, one for the men who scrubbed floors and another for the men who signed invoices, and the gap between them was measured in dollars and in bones. The first week I moved like an animal pushed into a trap, obeying, surviving, cataloging everything I could possibly touch without ever letting them suspect I was cataloging anything at all. What I saw day after day was worse than petty cruelty. It was organized, practiced, and cloaked in spreadsheets. Marcus and a handful of managers ran a soft theft that smelled faintly of turf and old money. They ordered premium parts and took cheaper substitutes from a back room. They filled safety logs with photocopied dates and names that belonged to men who had quit. I watched a stack of maintenance requests labeled critical collect dust, while a vendor invoice for those supposed repairs moved through accounting like a salve. Once, in the dim light of a weekend shift where the machines hummed like sleeping beasts, I was sent to pull the drain plug under a press where the bolt had been cross-threaded on purpose, so it would leak later, giving Marcus a reason to sign off on emergency repairs to his shell company. The temerity of their dishonesty was a kind of arrogance I could taste, and it made my teeth ache. Sometimes the cruelty slipped into violence. They pressured an older line worker named Javier to work overtime despite a pinned shoulder, and then falsified his injury report when he finally collapsed. Marcus cut corners on a safety harness and told the crew it was old but good enough. And when Javier fell, he was sent to a hospital they'd not bothered to list in the official logs, and the company doctor wrote something neat and cold about pre-existing conditions that never existed. Marcus called it business, and the HR director, Lydia, wrote it down in her little book with a pen that never missed a dot. Lydia smiled in a way that suggested teeth and then turned away when Javier's wife came by seeking an explanation. The whole system was a machine that chewed people up and spit out numbers, and everyone who profited from it looked at the parts as if they were just parts and not people. My anger was a slow burn that kept me steady instead of stupid. I would have liked to throw a wrench at Marcus the first week when he laughed at me for dropping a crate, but I knew the kind of hunger that would have started inside me then would have cost me everything. Instead, I played the role of incompetent fool to let them reveal themselves. When they moved invoices through an old desktop in the break room, I lingered by the coffee pot and pretended not to notice the USB stick that Marcus joked about losing, a stick that seemed to contain his private life and his nervous patterns. When the night crew left the terminals unlocked, I sat with a cup of bad coffee and used a cheap recovery tool on the machine, pulling up deleted emails from a vendor named Solace Supply and finding the dates that didn't match deliveries, the amounts that didn't match receipts. The names were pseudonyms, but the bank transfers were real, and the tail of money pointing at Marcus was a bright, shameful color. Rosa became more than a nod as the days wore on. I watched her shoulder bags and the way she hid a ledger in a seam. Eventually, after a week of late shifts and shared smokes outside the rear loading bay where we both pretended to be alone, she let me see the inside of that bag. It was a leather thing, worn at the corners, and it smelled like dryer lint and mint gum. Inside were hand-copied delivery notes, a torn payroll stub with numbers circled in pencil, and a tiny list of account numbers that meant nothing by themselves until I matched them with the transfers on the recovered files. She didn't know my name beyond the one they gave me. She didn't know I owned the company in trust. She had her reasons for keeping quiet and for trusting a man who looked like a loser. She told me she couldn't afford to lose this job because of her daughter, and the way she bit her lip when she said it made a little white scar inside my chest that wouldn't heal easily. By the end of the second week, I had a methodical collection of sins. Recorded conversations where Marcus coached a foreman to lose inspection paperwork, photographs of mismarked parts hidden in boxes that should have held certified gear, and the chant of ledger entries that traced payments to a shell company registered under a name that never sent any product. Each item was a tiny flare in a map that already pointed to the rot. The abuse I endured, the spit of a cigarette butt on my boot from a supervisor, the derisive slap on the back that nearly broke my ribs, only hardened my resolve. Pain was currency here. It bought me proximity, and proximity bought me secrets. I kept my head down, my recorder warm beneath my hat, and my pen full of notes, because in a place where contempt was culture, proof would be the only language that could tear it down. I was sweeping under the stairwell when I saw the folder, half sticking out under the manager's door like it was ashamed of what it held, and for a second all the sounds of the shop faded into a hum. Marcus had gone inside to chew out a forklift driver, and the office light was on, the cheap fluorescent buzzing like an insect. I could have walked away and pretended not to notice, kept sweeping, kept the badge on a lanyard that meant nothing. But there are moments when the air itself seems to push you toward a door. The folder had a label you could read even from the hall, facility closure and asset transfer plan, and I remember my hand going cold and my heart starting to beat a rhythm I knew too well from my father's hospital room, that slow, terrified drum of this is real and it is happening. I did not force the door. I waited long enough to taste the risk. The drivers outside laughed, someone dropped a steel crate in Bay 4 and it sounded like thunder, and Marcus stepped out swearing and his voice swallowed the laughter like a trench swallowed the tide. He forgot to lock the door because he forgot everything that didn't line his pockets. I told myself I would be quick, that a single glance would not be a betrayal. My feet carried me up the stairs in soft steps because men who are watching try to look like they belong, so I looked for a reason to be there. I told him I needed a replacement bolt that was kept on the manager's shelf, and he snorted, the way a man snorts when he thinks he has taught a dog to beg. "Make it quick, new guy," he said, and that sounded like permission. Inside the folder were pages that smelled like money and old coffee, as if currency had long since soaked into the paper and made it part of the fabric. There were photographs of the property with lines drawn around the warehouse and a hand-scrawled note that read inventory fires are planned for Q3 with smiley-faced initials. There was a spreadsheet with transaction columns and dates, and beneath the columns someone had written a list of names and bank routing numbers. I saw Solace Supply again, the vendor from the deleted emails, but this time they were not a vendor. They were an escrow, and the sums that passed through their accounts were the kind of numbers that move families, not nuts and bolts. My father had built this place out of sweat, not schemes, and here was the proof that men were planning to sell it to a developer who would level it next winter and call it progress. The part that made me physically lightheaded was not just the sums or the sale plan. Someone had the audacity to hand-draw a timeline of actions, and it had dates that lined up with board meetings, payroll cycles, and insurance lapses. It was a calendar of betrayal. At the bottom of one page in a different pen, Marcus had scrawled a note to Lydia saying, "Confirm signature swap with trustee by next Friday. He won't read fine print." My throat closed at the word trustee because that was a technicality I knew well. My name was on a trust document, yes, but the trustee was supposed to act for the company's goodwill and not for opportunists. Someone had a plan to replace or neuter the trustee, and my father's name was treated like a footnote in a ledger. I moved like a ghost. I took pictures with my phone, but not before slipping a white rubber band around the folder so no one would notice it was missing. The battery icon of my phone looked like a tiny accusation as it blinked, and when I took the first shot, the shutter seemed too loud. I angled the camera to catch the line items and the bank names, the developer Harrow Development Group, and the way the proposed sale price was suspiciously low compared to the book value. There was even a copy of a forged land use certificate with a stamp mark that did not belong to any city office I knew. Someone had drawn the stamp, and someone had paid for it. My hands shook when I scrolled through the photos later in the supply closet, hiding beneath a tarp in the smell of lacquer, and I felt something lift and also sink at the same exact time. There was a twist I didn't expect in the folder, a small one that flipped the whole thing from conspiracy into outright criminality. Tucked between the glossy aerial shots was a courier receipt for a deposit. The receipt was for a USD transfer to a small bank in a foreign jurisdiction 2 towns over, and the sender line had an account name that matched the shell company on the invoices. The kicker was a penciled notation beside the amount, $5K to caretaker, monthly starting 501. Caretaker, the word was so banal that if you read it without context you would miss it, but I did not miss that it matched a handwritten list Rosa had once shown me, the one she kept in the seam of her bag noting odd cash payments she witnessed into envelopes. Her scrawl had been rushed, like someone who wrote under watch, but the names matched. My breath came in short, hot pulls as I realized Rosa's ledger and Marcus folder were threads of the same rope. I left the folder where I found it and put back the rubber band like a man tucking a bomb into a locker before it exploded, because taking it would have been obvious, and because proof is stronger when it can be corroborated by what I had already gathered. I did, however, copy everything I could with the camera on my phone and hid the pictures inside a locked app that looked like a weather widget so the casual search would miss it. My pulse had the steadiness of someone who had chosen a lane and would not swerve. I went back to my broom and my fumes and my uniform with its threadbare badge, and I let Marcus shout at me for dirtying the hall because I had just found the first real crack in the wall. It was small and it was bright, and it meant I did not need to rely on suspicion anymore. I had a clue that would grow teeth if I fed it right. I learned to make the broom cart my second pocket and my uniform a mobile safe because the only way to be everywhere without asking questions was to look like you belonged to nothing at all. And that meant every late night I moved like a shadow with purpose. After the first clue, I stopped pretending to be clumsy on command and started pretending to be exactly what Marcus wanted me to be: small, replaceable, and reliably underfoot. That cover bought me access I would never have gotten in a suit. I pushed my cart into storage rooms, under vents, behind server racks, and into corners where men left evidence in the hope no one would notice. I learned the rhythm of when the floor emptied, when the security guard smoked behind the dumpsters, and when Lydia's office lights blinked off to hide a phone call that should have been logged. I wired my recorder into the brim of my hard hat and hollowed out the handle of my broom to hide an SD card that smelled faintly of oil, because if anyone tore me apart, they would only find a fellow janitor and not a chest of proof. I started staying until the lights were turned down and the machines hummed like distant bees, and in that quiet, I used the factory's own infrastructure against it. I sat at the night terminal in the break room and ran a search through the old shared drives, watching deleted folders reappear like ghosts as I used a basic recovery program. The screen populated with files that had names like Purchase Order 1123 Final and Invoice Approved Final, and inside them were PDFs that contradicted the paper copies I'd seen, the numbers carved into one line while the ledger stubbornly read another. One night I found video from a forgotten corner camera hidden behind a stack of crates, the angle that showed Bay 3 where Javier had been pushed too far. The footage didn't match the company report. It showed the harness strap frayed prior to the shift. It showed Marcus laughing in the doorway. I copied that file, heart pounding so hard I feared the keyboard would betray me. Then I noticed timestamps had been altered in other files and someone had tried to scrub the metadata. That told me two things simultaneously. They knew how to cover tracks and they were arrogant enough to believe they could. Arrogance is a weakness. It makes people sloppy and complacency leaves little clues like fingerprints on a ledger. Rosa was the quiet center of a small constellation of honest people on the line, and one midnight while the washers clicked like a metronome, I finally let her into more than nods. I told her, in fragments and half-truths, that I worried about her daughter and the pay stubs she'd shown me earlier, and she believed the man with the broom because she was used to believing desperate things. She slid me an envelope one time when no one watched, a pay stub with extra zeros penciled in, a torn receipt for cash that had been pocketed by someone in management. She wasn't a trained ally, she was a survivor who wanted to make sure her child had a bed and school books, and that ordinary courage, ordinary need became a hinge for everything I could not do alone. She smudged the lipstick off her collar and then looked at me as if she had given away more than paper. But I had given her a promise in return, to make this place safe enough for her daughter. There were close calls that felt like knives sliding past ribs. Once Marcus returned early from a site visit and surprised me rifling through a filing cabinet because I had thought the office empty. He stood in the doorway and I froze, pencil in mouth and a maintenance request folded like a confession. He smiled and said, "Lost something new, guy," in a voice that belonged to a man who keeps bad news in his pocket. I swallowed a lie and told him I was searching for a broom head replacement. He stepped in and flicked a paper on the floor with his boot, not looking at me as if I were air. I let him, and later, when he left, I found he had slammed the drawer closed so hard a paper corner bent like a broken promise. Those small embarrassments were the price of proximity. I documented everything like a bad novelist obsessed with proof. Photographs of mismarked boxes next to certified parts, spreadsheets with sums redlined, a map of the property with parcels shaded in a developer's color, and a receipt for a caretaker account that matched Rose's scribbles. I took copies of bank wires that proved transfers and hid them inside the casing of an old radio I found behind the tool bench. The radio played static during the day and my evidence at night, and the absurdity of it kept me steady. Each item I gathered I time-stamped and cross-referenced until the pattern was a net so tight it would not let them wiggle out. The more I took, the more they tried to push back in ways that were both petty and desperate. They reassigned me to midnight shifts exclusively for a week, They docked my time card for breaks I never took, and Marcus wrote up a performance issue that went into my file and smelled like poison. But being pushed into corners nudged me toward new shadows. I learned how to tail invoices through software accounts that were supposed to be closed, how to request physical manifests for deliveries and watch them come back with forged signatures, and how to make friends with the night security guard Malik, a man who enjoyed trivia and had a soft spot for people who could fix his ancient heater. Malik let me through doors when the locks were stupid, and the cost of doing the right thing was fewer cigarettes. He didn't know why I needed access, only that I did, and sometimes that was enough. When I finally had enough evidence stuffed into my improvised safe to make a case that could summon the law and shame, I knew the covert phase would end and the battle would begin. But those nights in the quiet, when the building breathed and the machines kept their secrets, were when I became something other than a scorned heir. I became the ledger's shadow, and I was learning to count. They called the 30-minute meeting like it was routine and it was anything but because Marcus had a plan. He wanted to dress up as justice. He stood at the front of the break room like a man about to be knighted, and the room smelled of stale coffee and betrayal. He held up a small sensor like a trophy, one of the high-precision parts I had seen cataloged in the folders, and he smiled at everyone like he was giving them a show. "Found this in his locker," he said, nodding toward me, and the laughter hit me like a fist because the locker was a place where men kept socks and cigarettes and sometimes their dignity. It was obvious theater. He had gone through the trouble of staging a theft, editing a clip from the surveillance footage, and bringing HR along to make the snap judgment look clean. Lydia read the company's zero tolerance line with a voice smooth like varnish, and the men who had laughed at me every morning felt comfortable enough to laugh now at the idea of me leaving. My badge was taken in front of everyone, and I was told I was suspended pending an investigation. And for a heartbeat, I felt the world narrow into the thickness of that badge being torn off. There was a skill to being humiliated in public and turning the collapse into fuel, but hunger is a sharp teacher and it taught me quick. Marcus wanted a headline the new guy stole and we fired him, and I could not let them have the narrative because the narrative would be everything. If they lowered me out on a scaffold of lies, every shred of evidence would count for nothing because I would be gone and my access terminated. My whole reason for being here, my father's legacy and the quiet majority of shares that meant nothing until someone used them, was on the table like a banquet for thieves. The anger that had been a slow burn became a bright flare and my hands stopped shaking. I moved. Rosa was the first to help without me asking because she had seen too much to pretend now. She slipped past a gaping mouth of security protocol and found me outside the office where they had left me to wait. Her face was pale but resolute, and she handed me a thin envelope like a smuggled relic. Inside were more of her scribbled ledgers and a photocopy of a payroll adjustment where Marcus had padded a contractor line and siphoned the difference. She said they'll come for me next, and that was both plea and weapon. Malik came with her, the night guard who owed me nothing but who liked the idea of things being right. He had watched the footage Marcus used and kept a raw download of the full feed on his phone, an unedited file that showed a hand planting the sensor and Marcus lingering in the hall like a man who cleans up his own stage. Malik's eyes were tired, but they held a kind of anger I had seen in the factory's older walls, and he handed me the phone without a question. Marcus upped the harassment after that, turning my suspension into a vendetta. He cut my hours on paper so it looked like I had quit sometimes, and he instructed the foreman to give new guy whatever dirt work makes him squirm. He followed me on breaks and laughed when I looked down. He bragged loud enough that other men heard, and he began collecting small settlements from contractors to keep them quiet, dangling cash so they would forget what they had seen. His paranoia was a growing thing, a weed that distorted his decisions. He began to leave documents in plain sight like bait, and he sent shorter, angrier emails to Lydia with reference lines like trustee cooperation that he thought were private. He had created his own noise, and in that noise he made mistakes. The urgency changed my plans overnight. I could no longer afford slow, careful cataloging. I had to move the mountain before they moved the markers. The broom cart became my safe again, the hollowed handle my repository, but now I used it like a surgical tool. Malik lent me a maintenance master key because he trusted my hands and because he had a brother who had once been ground down by men like Marcus. Keys move doors more efficiently than words. I went into Marcus' office under a different kind of pretense to fetch a mislabeled bolt for a machine he needed immediately, and the door was ajar because Marcus liked to leave a show open when he expected applause. Inside, I found what I had hoped was there and what terrified me. A thumb drive stuck to the underside of a drawer with tape, a recorder that someone had used to capture meetings with Harrow Development, and with a number that matched a Shell account. There was an audio file where Marcus laughed about moving inventory through Solace, and Lydia's voice saying, We will have the trustee in his chair next quarter. His arthritis may help him sign without reading. The words hit my chest like a blow. I copied everything onto two separate devices, one tucked into my broom handle and the other pushed into the hollow of an old radio that only played static until you cracked it open. Then I did the stupid brave thing that people do when they have no other angle. I left a copy in an anonymous envelope at the front desk of the law firm that had once handled my father's estate, and another in the mailbox of a local investigative reporter who had a nose for crooked developers. I could have mailed them, but people open envelopes faster when they can point a finger at the sender, and anonymity is a kind of armor I needed. I also uploaded a handful of files to a cloud account I created under a fake name and sent the link, encrypted and messy, to a lawyer friend from college who owed me a favor and who hated corrupt directors more than he liked charging by the hour. He would not know me as the owner, just as the man who had sent him a thread of proof that smelled like burned paper. As I walked back into the shop with my badge still in HR hands and a new weight in my pockets, I felt like a man walking into a ring with both gloves on and a plan. Marcus watched me and thought he had crippled me, but he had only hastened the clock. He had made paranoia into a mistake, and my acceleration of events had begun. The next few days would not be about quiet collection. They would be about setting traps with evidence and forcing the board and the law to choose whether to listen to a janitor or to their own reflection in the corporate mirror. I could taste the judgment coming, and it was cruel, sharp, and almost delicious. They had me in a corner, figuratively and literally, when the news landed like a thrown stone. Marcus had been pacing the break room with the smugness of a man who had just polished his shoe with someone else's reputation. Lydia had already started the paperwork for termination. The HR script read smooth off her tongue like she'd practiced it in front of the mirror, and a few of the foremen were swapping the kind of smiles that mean they're ready to point and laugh. I had just enough time to fold my hands around a paper cup of coffee and pretend my hands weren't shaking when the front desk buzzed, and Malik went to answer a courier who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. The envelope the courier handed over was nothing dramatic at first glance, just thick stock paper with an embossed return address that suggested formality and the sort of money that slides across a table without a sound. Malik glanced at Lydia, and she unfolded it like someone reading a spoiler for the end of a story. Her eyes flicked to the signature line and the color drained from her face in little increments, like a clock winding down. The paper read like a legal hammer. An anonymous shareholder had called for an urgent all-hands meeting to review material irregularities relating to asset disposition, vendor procurement, and executive agreements. It demanded immediate production of trustee records and vendor accounts, and it requested that the board convene within 48 hours with counsel present. You could see the math running across Marcus' face. He pictured the meeting as his stage, the room as a place to finish the script with me already ushered out. He folded his hands like he was holding a prize and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Let them show their cards. We'll clear this up fast." He spoke with that certain casual cruelty of someone who believes the world exists to be bent to his will. The other managers shrugged, half bored, half confident, because this sounded like a nuisance to them rather than a threat. They were rich in arrogance and poor in fear. That was their real weakness. I had arranged for that envelope. I could feel the secret of it burn in my pocket like a coal. I had used a name that meant nothing on paper and everything legally, a shell my lawyer friend had helped set up to exercise shareholder rights without waving my own name in their faces. It was the kind of technicality that can topple men who think proof is only what your cronies will vouch for. He filed the notice carefully, as if we were two thieves in a library selecting a book that could break a city. He sent it anonymously because the law allows a shareholder to call a meeting when there is reasonable cause, and because sometimes the truth needs a mask before it can be spoken loudly. I watched them walk toward the elevator to the boardroom like it was a parade. Marcus straightened his jacket in a way that suggested he was going to polish more than his cufflinks. He welcomed the meeting as a board actor welcomes an encore, certain the audience will clap the way he has taught them to. Lydia smoothed the papers in her hand and gave me a look like she wanted to finish the job and move on. The board members who had been lining up with Marcus at the hinge of the rot, men and women who had skylit offices and leased smiles, murmured about gardening committees and budget reallocations, as if the words on the envelope were a quiz they had not studied for. I had three things working for me: law, evidence, and patience turned lethal. But until the boardroom door closed, I still had to be a janitor with a broom and a badge that said nothing. Malik had been a quiet conspirator, feeding me access and watching door footage for a week in exchange for the promise I'd looked into a heater part for his brother. He nodded at me once, and that was enough. He said nothing, because sometimes the bravest things are the quietest. Rosa stayed on the floor folding boxes like she had always folded them, but she'd winked when the envelope arrived, and that small motion felt like an oath. She had slipped me an extra pay stub and a photocopy of a delivery manifest, and one look at her face in that hallway told me she was ready to lose everything in pursuit of something right. They filed into the boardroom with confidence like they'd rehearsed this exact posture in front of mirrors. Marcus took the head of the table with a grin that felt rehearsed, the kind of grin that stops being a smile and starts being a debt. The boardroom smelled of lemon cleaner and leather and cologne that cost more than a month of Rose's rent. They slid into chairs with the languid air of men who decide who wins and who loses at lunch. A few of the directors exchanged a glance that I read like a ledger closing. The ones who had fingers in deals were calm, because calm is often how guilty people pretend innocence. I hovered outside the door because that was where I was allowed to be, mop bucket to my left, cart with spare rags to my right, and a hollowed broom handle that now felt like a loaded gun. I could have walked in and announced the thing that would make their faces rearrange themselves with horror, but that would have been spectacle without teeth. The anonymous shareholder had done the calling. Now it needed teeth from the evidence I had hidden away, from the files Malik had kept from Rose's ledger and the thumb drive taped under a drawer. The board would probably expect a tedious dispute among petty men. They thought they were walking into boredom. They did not know what lurked at the edge of their routine. The doors closed behind them with a clack that sounded like a gavel, and for a breath, the whole plant seemed to exhale. I leaned my head against the cool metal of the mop handle and let my heart beat slow, because the thing I had been waiting for was finally here, and the rest would be a long, careful storm. I pushed the boardroom door open with the same surety I used to push my broom into Bay 3, and the sound of it closing behind me felt like the last piece of showmanship Marcus had ever get to enjoy. He laughed first, a short bark that meant he thought he knew the punchline. The other managers smiled the way people smile at a street performer they mean to tip later, indulgent and unafraid. I was still in my safety vest, my badge dangling like an insult, hands ink-stained from copied documents and a little of the day's grease under my nails. The room smelled exactly like I remembered it smelling when I'd visited my father in his office: lemon cleaner, expensive cologne, and the faint dryness of old paper. For a moment I felt the twin pulls of grief and purpose twist in my chest until only a single thing remained: do it right. The company's lawyer, a trim man named Carter who looked like he had been carved from a ledger, stood and folded his hands as if he were about to read scripture. He did not look at Marcus when he spoke. He looked at the table and at me, and then he said in a voice that had the same flat quiet as a judge, "Ladies and gentlemen, the anonymous shareholder who called this meeting has requested that the majority shareholder be allowed to present." He opened an envelope, slid a document across the polished wood, and then said my name. He said it exactly as it was on the trust paperwork, the name that no one in the room had seen in years, the name that meant I owned this company not by rumor but by law. The laughter died like a dropped glass. Someone inhaled sharply. Marcus' grin cracked. I did not shout, I did not demand. I walked to the head of the table and set the stack of evidence down like a cleanly made accusation: printed copies of bank transfers, photos of mismarked parts, the courier receipt for the foreign deposit, the forged land use certificate, and a little recorder whose taped file could not be denied. The room filled with a static that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Carter clicked a remote and the projector hummed to life, not for a glossy slide deck but for the raw stuff: timestamps, emails, deleted file recoveries, and surveillance footage with the unedited timestamps Malik had kept. It was not pretty. It was not rhetorical. It was a string of facts, each one heavy enough to sink a man. I started with the payroll irregularities because numbers are hard to argue with and they carry the smell of truth. I showed how contractor invoices were padded, how premium parts had been replaced with counterfeit substitutes, and how payments had moved through Solace Supply into a shell account. I played a clip where Marcus' voice was clear as a bell, instructing a foreman to lose inspection paperwork and to move inventory through Solace, while Lydia's laugh came on the tape like a second head to his corruption. Faces went pale. Someone at the far end of the table muttered an oath that sounded like a prayer to material things being broken. I could see the calculus in their eyes collapsing into survival mode. Then I played Malik's footage of Bay 3, the night the harness strap was frayed before the shift, and Marcus lingered in the doorway and laughed. The footage showed Marcus placing the sensor near a locker and then exiting nonchalantly while the edited clip he used against me had been cropped to make me look guilty. Javier's injury report was a neat sheet with a doctor's stamp. The real footage was a messy, ugly truth. I cued Rosa up to stand. She rose slowly, hands trembling, and read aloud the list of caretaker deposits she had scribbled into the seam of her ledger. I passed the photocopies across the table. The numbers aligned with the bank wires. Paper met pixels and they matched like fingerprints. There were two clinchers I had saved for the last, and when I played them, the room went almost soundless. The first was the folder Marcus had left under his own door, the facility closure and asset transfer plan with smiley-faced initials, the hand-drawn timeline of burned inventory and planned emergency repairs, and the earnest penciled note promising a neutral trustee who would not read fine print. The second was the thumb drive taped under Marcus' desk with recordings of his calls with Harrow Development and an email where a board member's name, one of those polite directors with the skylit office, appeared as a recipient of kickback instructions. The realization spread across the board like an oil stain. People who had used their positions to treat human lives like ledger lines looked suddenly very small. Marcus tried to speak. He opened his mouth and the room watched a man attempting to retake a stage. I let him flail for a breath and then I read the clause in the trust documents aloud, because legality was what my lawyer had insisted upon. The majority shareholder has the right to remove directors for cause and call for immediate forensic audit. Carter had already placed calls. He had waited until my presentation had removed all plausible deniability. I announced calmly that I was invoking those rights, that an independent audit with criminal referral would commence immediately, and that law enforcement and regulatory counsel were on the way. The order was not an outburst. It was a small, deadly mechanism clicking into place. Some asked for more time, some reached for old friendships like lifelines. A few stood and left the room in a silence that felt like capitulation. Marcus sat down like a man whose kingdom had been quietly repossessed, and the look he gave me was not of surprise but of being finally seen by someone who had refused to bow. I felt no triumph in his eyes. I felt only the gravity of things set right. The evidence was a hammer, but what made it surgical was the law, the allies who had risked quiet courage, and the patience that had stretched through long nights. When the first phone call to the regulator was answered and a voice asked for confirmation of the meeting, the boardroom's last defenses fell away into the kind of silence that only follows correctable wrongdoing. The first sound that broke the stunned silence in the boardroom was not applause but the soft, legal clack of cuffs. Someone from corporate security opened the door and the men who had ruled the floor like gods were suddenly small and human-sized, their collars twisted, their ties askew like flags in surrender. Marcus tried to keep his face a mask, asked for counsel, spat out a few angry words that sounded like they belonged on a loading dock, and then he was led away. They moved him with an efficiency that felt clinical, as if this had all been rehearsed by people who knew what to do when a kingdom collapsed. Lydia went fast too. She reached for dignity and landed on resignation papers and a request to consult, which investigators declined. The directors who'd whispered about deals and vacations either resigned or were placed on immediate leave while regulators took the files and made phone calls that had the tone of finality. Outside the glass doors, the press smelled like citrus and cheap cologne and cameras flashed like lightning bugs at dusk. Harrow Development announced it had initiated its own internal review when a reporter pushed them, and their chairman's smooth statement was full of legalese and regret. The shell accounts that had drained money and misdirected inventory were frozen within hours, thanks to the forensic team Carter had called. Phone numbers I had found in drawer recordings suddenly lit up at agencies that answered with a directness I had never seen in administrative offices. It was not a fairy tale. It was a messy, slow law in motion, with subpoenas instead of swords, and the satisfaction came in legal language and court filings rather than dramatic shouting. Back on the factory floor, the reaction landed like rain after a drought. At first, there was a kind of stunned quiet, a collective exhale as if everyone had been holding their breath for months. Then things happened that felt almost tender. Veterans who had suffered in silence came forward to sign affidavits. Rose's ledger became a reference document for investigators. Malik's unedited camera files were copied and catalogued. And Javier, who had been shuffled into a van with a torn report, walked back into the plant wearing a sling and a look that was part relief and part reclaimed pride. I watched men who had made a living on sarcasm and scorn sit down and cry without shame. And something inside me eased, because what we had done was not just to remove thieves from power, but to give people permission to feel again. I promoted Rosa that afternoon in a way that felt both practical and ceremonial. In front of the crew, I slid a handwritten letter across to her and asked her to stand as the new safety and inventory manager, because she had not only kept records but had learned how to hold truth like a shield. Her jaw trembled and she laughed at first like it was a joke, then accepted the responsibility with a steadiness that anchored the room. Malik was offered the head of security role with a stipend and a replacement heater part for his brother. He accepted with a nod and a grin that looked like a contract signed in trust. I made sure Javier was on full paid leave with disability coverage that actually meant something. And I instructed accounting to do a full reconciliation to recover lost wages and retroactive pay for anyone we could verify had been shorted. We called in a union liaison even though the plant had been anti-union, because reconciliation needed structures that lasted beyond speeches. Standing in the center of that factory, with the history of my father's hands built into the beams, I gave a speech that I didn't plan to write but found myself saying anyway. I told them about the trust, about my nights with a broom and a recorder, about the folder under Marcus' door and the ledger Rosa kept hidden in a seam. I told them I would not pretend to be anything other than a man who had learned humility from being broken down, and I promised a regime of transparency, open books for the staff, an anonymous whistleblower line managed by a third party, safety audits every quarter, and an independent board seat for an employee representative. I asked them not to trust me just because of a name on a plaque, but to hold me accountable, to call the numbers on the wall when something smelled wrong. There were setbacks and small stumbles in the week that followed. Some of the accused had lawyers with sharp teeth and delayed motions that smelled like the old world trying to bite back. A vendor from 2 towns over insisted he had proof of legitimate work, and a few invoices required painful interviews before they could be declared fraudulent. The trustee who had been spoken of in Marcus' notes resigned quietly and cooperated rather than obstructed, and a few directors tried to paint themselves as victims of influence. But the evidence we had pulled from drives, from camera backups, and from honest hands like Rose's was comprehensive and ugly, and prosecutors moved with the kind of efficiency that felt like healing. The final thing I did before leaving the plant that night was small and private. I climbed the stairs to my father's old office, the plaque with his name still warm under the lamp, and I set down the dusty hard hat I'd worn for months like a reliquary. I took out the old company charter and signed a new page, one that inserted clear language about ethics, whistleblower protection, and community investment. When I walked back onto the floor, people called my name. Some hesitated, then used boss like a new nickname. I told them to call me by my given name instead, the one my father used when he taught me how to thread a bolt. We walked the line together that night, men and women who had once thought themselves disposable now moving in a rhythm that felt like repair, and the plant hummed like a thing waking up from a long, dangerous sleep.